increasingly clear that Europol and Frontex are replicating at EU level the conflation we see across member states of immigration and criminality. So very concretely, the PEDRA system, for which there was a hearing yesterday, the processing of personal data for risk analysis involving intrusive data collection collected by Frontex officers when they question an interview who've just arrived in the EU to feed into Europol's vast criminal databases. This project, as it is was coined, began in 2016 on the back of the French authorities linking the November 2015 attack to refugees. And this raises very uncomfortable questions that we need to address, that need to be asked. Is PEDRA, for instance, a result of racist and Islamophobic narratives that thrive off fear? And have these narratives, these populist narratives, been used to expand policing powers in Europe? So these questions are uncomfortable, but need to be asked, especially as we see this consolidation of a data-driven model of policing, where EU instruments are increasingly working towards having interoperability between different databases. And there's a real need to challenge, to question, as Birgit has pointed out, the quality of the data that is being fed into these systems. So there is hope with the European Parliament that has exercised, as Saskia said, put a foot in the door, exercising a lot of their powers of scrutiny. And it was also clear in the recent hearings I found the difficulty in terms of getting transparency from Europol and Frontex on their activities. And so the purpose of having us all together today is to talk about how we can participate in demanding transparency, demanding accountability. So we will hear from concerns from different civil society representatives about concerns about EU policing and also our role in participating in the scrutiny of the agencies. So first, I'm very happy to introduce Oyedaya, is that right? Oyedaya, sorry, from INAR. She's the Policy Advocacy Advisor for Digital Rights at the European Network Against Racism, and her work focuses on the AI Act developments in particular. So can we take a step back and reflect on what Europol and Frontex have been telling us, that they are only coming in to support, to coordinate activities by national law enforcement. And I think this really requires us to take a step back and to talk about what policing looks like. I think this is really the only way we can understand what is the data and what are the activities that Europol is supporting. So I'd just like to invite you to share your reflections and the work you've done on policing in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Lo. First of all, I would like to thank you because for inviting Inar to this panel and for you to being interested in this topic, which I think it's very, very interesting. And so the first thing I would like to talk about, it's about criminalization, and especially the criminalization of racialized people, especially those who come from refugees and migrant backgrounds. This is something that it's not from now, it's something that has been historical. And in many cases, the ways in which police or agencies have been doing this criminalization of migrants, it's something that already it's deeply rooted in colonialism, in a way that many of the techniques that are using nowadays already come from that era. And for example, nowadays, what we can find is that there's agencies who are taking information from our families, from our relatives, friends, in order to gather information from certain people. And these people usually are people of color. In order to create suspect lists that we don't know the kind of information they are taking, why they are taking it from those specific people, and how this is going to be managed in the end. And it is, for example, in France, what happens is that Black people and people from North African heritage are 20 times more likely to be stopped in the streets in France. This is just one statistic from one country, but we can already spread it around across Europe, and we will see that the numbers are more or less the same. So this is something that it's completely deeply rooted in our society, in the law enforcement, and it's something that should be revised. And nowadays we have predictive policing, which is something that we must take into account, and that we should try to see what they are trying to tackle and who they are trying to tackle. Because when especially this happens to men, but people who are, I would say, but it's something that I don't want to say, but they are normalizing being stopped, arrested, or even questioned by the police. It is something that it shouldn't be normal, but they have to act like it is a normal thing. And just to take into account that this is affecting their lives. And in the case, for example, of COVID-19, which is, I think it is the closest way in which we can relate to that in terms of being stopped at any point of our streets, because maybe we were just breaking the law during COVID-19. This is something that probably we are closer to that feeling, but imagine having this all your life. And COVID-19 has been like a very big point, or very strong point, in which many of these practices have been enhanced and even more permitted. For example, we know that at Moria camp in Lesbos, it has been happening that it has been affecting many people with their mental health, because they needed a special pass in order to get out of the camp, and maybe, for example, do their groceries or activities that before that they were able to do. And being stopped is something that it shouldn't be natural or naturalized by people. And nowadays, when we are working, or when we know that agencies are working with predictive policing, and they are using data that historically we know that has been targeting Black, brown, and many other ethnic minorities, it's something that worries us. Because in the end, technology is the only thing that it's doing is just replying or even multiplying the effects of policing into those communities. Many times we think that technology is something that it's equanimous for all of us, but in the end, it's not equanimous at all. Especially, we know it, the people who have always been affected by these kind of stories, because we know that usually we are always the same people who are going to be stopped, who are going to be requested, and who will be having to answer to many more questions than the rest. And well, one thing that that we have been working at with our reports, it's how COVID-19 has been affecting racialized communities in different countries around Europe, especially, or some of the countries that I can mention are Belgium, France, Croatia, and how this has been affecting very, very hard on communities of color. And how the freedom of movement has been something that has been like a key point in order to control and to detect who must be in our streets and who doesn't. So I think it is very important and very, very remarkable to think that refugees and people with migrant background should be listened in these cases, and that we should try to find other ways in which we can try to do policing, because it seems like we are not listening to the victims. It's just like we are trying to bring more tools, more techniques, in order that the police can continue controlling us, can continue telling us if we can stay here, and this is something. And at the same time, it is very important to acknowledge that these people in the end, they are kind of trespassing this kind of feeling, like the communities that are being affected are kind of transmitting this information through generations. They are dragging this information, this sorrow or this feeling that you are not feeling welcomed in your country. Because in the end, there's a moment where you feel like this is the place where you want to be, and you are not feeling like that. And and from these reports, we have found that criminalization is something, it's a key point in one of the things that we should try to remove, or at least not to link criminalization with certain communities, because what has been happening is that we have been targeting specifically certain people because of their behavior, because of certain behaviors that if you try to see them individually, there's nothing bad about those behaviors, but if you combine them all, in the end, it happens that those behaviors, they are always linked to the same kind of people. So I would like to also give like another alternative to justice in the end. I think that we should try to find other mechanisms that can break this way of providing public safety. Because there should be other ways of taking care of our spaces, not only our private spaces, but also our public spaces. So I think that one example that could work is having into account transformative justice. It's something that it's not about limiting the views of police forces or agencies. It's more thinking about the community. It's more about reinforcing the role that the communities have, because they have the power to understand what is happening, where, and the way to address it, probably. So it's in a way, it is more about investing or trying to reinvest the money that many times we are giving to the police, to the communities. In which ways? It could be in ways that, in the end, it's using more common sense and investing in education, in mental health, because it's something that it's super important. And in the end, we know that it's after it reverts, and you can see like the great things that investing in mental health can do in our society, and also in supporting migrants, supporting the migrants that are already in our borders, and trying to make this into account, trying to enhance this kind of activities, because they are going to stay here, they are not going to move. There are many people who are already European citizens, and this is something that people should take into account. So I think that taking into account transformative justice, it's something that we should take more into account, thinking that there must be other ways of policing. I mean, agencies are okay, but there's a limit about it. And it's about taking care of the people that they're also contributing to our society, and not leaving them apart, because the only thing that let's say that when you give hate, people will always reply with hate. And with a transformative justice perspective, what you're trying to do is having a better conversation about what is happening, and trying to add the police perspective. I mean, trying to bring another perspective into this, and think that there might be more ways to talk between communities and policing agencies.
Thank you. For starting off by reminding us all what it means, what policing means for people who are affected. And I think this is really the starting point of the discussion, should be at the center and front of the discussions on policing, rather than about more tools, more tech, more data. So thank you very much. And it really is compelling to hear and to reflect on how this these systems are being set up in different member states. I was hearing a few weeks ago a presentation about Denmark, how the Danish system as well had created a 2-tier level of citizenship based on your family's migration status, for instance. Sweden as well in that same direction, and conflating criminalization and migration measures by, for instance, focusing on certain areas that are called border areas, where police has special measures and special ways to investigate and to enforce and punish, including by removing possibilities for people to stay in Sweden. So this is a very compelling and pressing point that we need to address. Thank you as well for raising other ways that I think we should really get back to in the discussion, other ways of policing, in particular on supporting, looking into transformative justice and what communities can be doing to create public safety. So thank you very much. Now I'll hand over to Michel Levoix, who's joining us online because of the strike. Thank you very much for your patience as well in getting connected. Michel is the director of PICUM, the platform for undocumented migrants. Welcome, Michel. I think we've already discussed a lot the links between policing and migration, and it would be great if you could expand more on that conflation, and in particular how you see it happening as well at an EU level through different instruments and measures. Thank you, Michel. Over to you.
Thanks, Laura. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay. So thank you, Laura, Saskia. Thanks to your teams also for the support and enabling me to come in online. Would love to actually be in the room with you today. It was great to hear Oyedia's input from INAR, and I think it really sets the tone and the framing. What I would like to do is maybe give 4 examples here of how we see from PICUM's perspective kind of the impact of policing on undocumented migrants, and then some recommendations. So the first one is policing and immigration enforcement within borders. So we see that migration policy itself, it's not limited to who can enter and stay under what conditions. It's actually a whole policy that's enforced in various ways, even within borders. And we see the role of law enforcement and immigration control in our communities, and the role of other sectors in identifying undocumented people who attempt to use services. So for example, from the area of health, in Germany, Section 87 of the Residence Act requires healthcare providers to report undocumented migrants to immigration control. Very interestingly, the coalition government agreement from December of last year has pledged to lift these obligations. But the fact that this is still a law which is on the books creates a lot of confusion for people in Germany in terms, when they're undocumented, in terms of trying to access healthcare. Another example is what happens if you suffer a crime when you're undocumented. In the UK, in Belgium, and the Netherlands, your personal data, when you go to the police, might be shared with immigration authorities because of this lack of firewalls in between justice and immigration authorities. The Latin American Women Rights Service, a PICUM member, did a report in 2019 called The Right to be Believed, where it found that 27% of women in the undocumented women in the UK who reported to the police had their residence permit questioned, and 18% of those women were arrested for immigration issues because they reported a crime. The second area that I want to talk about is discriminatory profiling. So we see, and this is also building on INAR's findings as well, that the criminalization of migration results in profiling, and it can interact with other forms of criminalization. And here's an example from sex work. So in Sweden, Norway, and Finland, non-EU or EUA citizens face deportation and denial of entry if they are suspected of selling or intending to sell sex. These laws give the give more power to the police to surveil and harass sex workers. And we also see the racial justice dimensions between this relationship between policing and immigration enforcement. The Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU did research in 2021, which showed that people from an ethnic minority are disproportionately affected by police stops, both when they're walking and also when they're in a vehicle. And the FRA also had done a report in 2014, which showed that 79% of surveyed border guards at airports rated ethnicity as a helpful indicator to identify people attempting to enter the country in a regular manner before speaking to them. In December of last year, Dutch border police said that they would stop using ethnic profiling as a criteria to carry out identity checks after a huge public outcry. The third area that I wanted to talk about is big data and the EU's interoperable migration systems. So what are these in particular? In 2019, the EU had new regulations for what we call interoperable IT systems. So this revolves around the CIR. It's the Central Information Repository, which has a capacity to store up to 300 million records. And what does the CIR want to do? It makes it easier or simplified for national authorities in Europol to access databases such as the EES, the Entry-Exit System, Eurodac, ETIAS, and VIS, where necessary for the prevention, detection, or investigation of terrorist offenses or other serious criminal offenses. So basically, the EU is actually spending a huge amount of resources in developing this colossal IT system based on the discriminatory assumption that there's a link between terrorism and irregular migration. So we do have to interrogate the whole framework that's the foundation for this, that all non-nationals of the EU are potential threats. And why are these IT systems problematic in practice? The organization Statewatch did a report this year on building the biometric state. And it said that a key aim of this whole interoperability project is to increase stops and deportations. And how would this be done? If police officers and immigration officials have mobile identification devices that can scan someone's fingerprints or faces in the street to verify someone's identity. So some examples. In 2019 in France, the police granted power to check on the basis of fingerprints of a foreigner without a document, whether or not they have a permit. In Germany, in Hamburg, there's a mobile phone app that lets police scan fingerprints using a smartphone, etc. So the last point that I want to mention is this conflation of administrative law and criminal law. And this is an area in the migration space that has been looked at by some researchers and NGOs in recent years, but it's increasingly worrying because the conflation of these two kind of sets of laws basically treats irregular migration, which should be an administrative issue, as a crime. And it introduces unlawful derogations from fair trial safeguards, which are at the core of criminal law. So on the one hand, in the criminal law space, states are increasingly using criminal law as a migration enforcement instrument to prevent irregular migration. The Fundamental Rights Agency did another study in 2014, where it found that in 16 of the 27 EU member states, people who enter or stay irregularly, or both, could be sentenced with imprisonment or a fine. Our member organization Human Rights 360 in Greece has reported that judicial authorities are tending to convict newcomers to Greece with the offense of irregular entry, applying disproportionately heavy penalties of up to 2 years in prison, even without the possibility of suspension. And we see this also with the focus on return and deportation. In the European Commission communication on the Pact on Migration, the term rights only appears 14 times, whereas the actual word return appears 100 times. So that was kind of the criminal law, but on the administrative law, we've also seen that within this sphere, it's being used to pursue criminal law objectives. And basically the effect of this is that it creates double standards in terms of accessing fair trial guarantees. We see from the Commission's 2018 proposal to amend the Return Directive, which is from 2008, that member states could detain undocumented if they pose a risk to public policy, public security, or national security. Basically, this proposal would allow member states to apply lower safeguards, and it would introduce a ground for discrimination between migrants and EU citizens, because individuals who face the same circumstances, being suspected of terrorism, would be treated under two completely different sets of laws. So in this example, third country nationals, undocumented migrants, would be held in immigration detention centers with no safeguards, no fixed duration, and no trial, whereas an EU citizen would have access to fair trial guarantees. I had a comment on the PEDRA program, but I'll maybe leave that because I think you mentioned it at the beginning. I'll just go now to the end and the recommendations. So here I wanted to mention 3 points. The first one is to reform our approach, the laws, the policies, and practices to migration. Obviously, that's a big ask. But what I wanted to highlight here under this is that the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum came out in September 2020. Actually, it was 5 working days after the Commission issued the EU's first ARAP, the Anti-Racism Action Plan. And the Pact on Migration was framed as a fresh start on migration, but it continues this deterrence-oriented agenda, which focuses really on scaling up detention and then return. The current approach in the EU relies heavily on immigration enforcement, and it's based on this model of surveillance, policing, due to this conflation between migration and security. So what we should be looking at is a new approach, which looks at a sustainable, forward-looking policies based on human rights and evidence. And the second recommendation is to address a lot of what Einar highlighted in your presentation at the beginning, to recognize, acknowledge, investigate, and document the existence of structural and institutional racism in the context of migration policies. So when we look at these particular forms of racism, we need to look beyond the stated aims of the policy to look at historical dimensions, to consider how the enforcement of certain policies and practices can be discriminatory and harmful. And we need to work together on this to document how all these policies and practices can just replicate forms of systemic racism and discrimination. The EU Action Plan on Racism, Against Racism, is actually an opening. So it's an opening that we can also use to confront this historical racism embedded in these systems. And the third and last point is on the Artificial Intelligence Act, the AI Act. In general, we recommend to support the calls made by broader civil society, and I'm sure that we'll hear this on the panel from EDRI, that recognize and address the fundamental rights implications of some of the uses of AI and limits the further application of AI for harmful policing and surveillance in the migration context. So concretely, ensuring that the AI Act applies to uses of AI in the context of the EU's migration databases. The current proposal would exempt them under Article 83. We call for ensuring that the uses of AI in the migration context for profiling and individual risk assessments, for polygraphs and emotion detection are recognized as presenting an unacceptable risk to human safety and to fundamental rights. And finally, to create individual rights in the AI Act as a basis for judicial remedies. So as a way to have an effective remedy. So I'd like to end there for time concerns and very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you for the big asks, which I think we need to make, and that's why we're here. So thank you very much. I'll move straight on to Chloe, and we may come back on PEDRA, if that's okay, Michelle, in the questions, and your views on that. But I'd like to hand over now, in view of time, to Chloe Berthelemy, who's Senior Policy Advisor at EDRI and who's been leading a campaign around Europol since at the time of the discussions around the revision of Europol's mandate. So, Chloe, can you, just continuing to probe these larger contexts in which EU policing is developing, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on Europol's expanded mandate and what you think in terms of the safeguards, both individual and more systemic oversight mechanism that are currently in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laure. Thank you for the invitation and for the great discussion. It's great to build on from previous speakers. Indeed, so I'm representing EDRI, European Digital Rights, and we are a network of 46 organizations across Europe that promote digital rights. And yes, more and more over the past years, we've been having a closer look at the role of EU policies, and in particular EU agencies in the field of justice and home affairs, because now we are observing more and more impact on people's rights and freedoms, and this is what we care about, and this is our mission. I'm going to focus mostly on Europol because this, as you mentioned, Laura, is our main area of expertise since we followed the recent reform adopted earlier this year in 2022, and trying to link it to the broader context. Briefly, just to maybe put everybody on the same page on the Europol latest reform 2022, there are many areas of reforms that this reform aimed at, but I will like to highlight three of them. The one is the expansion of possibilities to process data, categories of data, that was aimed at enabling the agency to process and analyze big data sets, so vast quantities of data, and notably allow the agency to have an exception to its current rules, which are restricting the list of categories of data that is allowed to process. So now Europol may allow itself to process data that are not data related to suspects, to victims of criminal activities, but also from innocent people, as we call them, or like persons who have no link to criminal activity. That was not the case before. Now it's allowed. There's also more possibilities for the agency to receive and exchange data with a growing range of actors, notably third countries through specific agreements and cooperation frameworks, as well as with private companies. So think of the banking sector, the social media platforms, air carriers, etc., etc. And lastly, Europol is given a role in the field of research and innovation. The agency is expected to produce its own research project, so training algorithm on the basis of the data it stores in its database, but also guide the European Commission in setting research priorities in the field of law enforcement. So how to best equip national law enforcement authorities, for example. Europol will play more and more a role in there. The reform, we see it as problematic for two reasons. First, it's a mass expansion of powers, which is not coupled with an equivalent expansion of independent oversight mechanism. And I will come back to that in a minute. And I think Fanny will complete this point very much at length. It's second, it legitimizes a data-driven policing model, as pointed out by Laure in our introduction. And for us, it poses a great threat to people's rights. In particular, we see a big risk for the rule of law because the reform very much confirms what Birgit very well described, which is a general trend towards predictive policing. And we see predictive policing as a great concern. First, because it relies on two elements. First, it encourages the vast collection of data, of personal data on very much everybody, leading to mass surveillance measures, such as mass retention of telecommunications data, air passengers data, tracking or monitoring of financial flows across borders, for example. And second, it also relies on the analysis of this bulk data and how we use that by means of, how do we do that? By means of algorithmic processing based on predetermined criteria, and you can imagine which ones, so country of origin, migration status, gender, etc. This is a process, kind of the processing upon which predictive policing relies, poses great threats, as I mentioned, to rights, notably, and freedoms, notably fair trial rights, the presumption of innocence, right to privacy, obviously, and the right to non-discrimination. And Europol has been increasingly involved in such algorithmic data analysis, giving an increasing role in this. So in face of such a problematic policing model that we are currently seeing developed at EU level, how do we see what's going on the other side? Like, what are the counterbalance to this? What are the measures put in place to counterbalance the expansion of powers? Well, if you look at it, it's not that great. First, there is a huge emphasis put on ex post safeguards, I would say. So after the processing has taken place of the personal data, there is a huge focus on individual data protection rights. Oh, don't worry, you're protected. You have the right to access, you have the right to rectification, you have the right to erasure under the GDPR if a private company, a private actor is involved, under the European DPR, data protection regulation. If an EU institution is processing your data, you have the rights, those rights under the law enforcement directive. This is not enough. There is a problem for 3 reasons here. The first is accessibility. There are many barriers to exercising those individual rights. I'm seeing Michelle moving her. I'm getting sick. Anyway, going back, like, there are a lot of barriers. Yeah, I wanted to highlight this because first, you're rarely notified that your data has been transferred from one authority to another, and you're barely aware that your data was transferred in particular to Europol. And then the other fact that we need to take into account is that not many individuals can exercise those data protection rights. I'm thinking of a particular status. You need to be well educated. You need to maybe seek legal advice to enforce those rights. And not everybody has access to such resources and not has a secure status to do that. It's a thing to go after law enforcement authority and ask and request information about your data. You need to be sure that you can possibly have consequences for that. And even if you do that and you have all the resources and status, is not given that your rights are going to be respected. And here I'm going to refer to Frank van der Linde's cases, which was mentioned briefly by Laure in her introduction. It's a Dutch activist who happened to have discovered that his data was transferred to Europol after being put on a terrorist watch list by the Dutch authority. And he moved to Germany, which led the Dutch authority to transfer his data to the German authority through Europol. This is problematic because when van der Linde learned about this, he tries to request access to the personal data that Europol had on him. Like, what do you have about me? And following the denial of his request, there was an EDPS investigation. And in the report of the EDPS, we learned that with the kind of support / recommendation of the Dutch authority, Europol had attempted to delete Frank van der Linde's data to avoid complying with the data access request. So rather delete than comply with individual right to access. So this is really complicated. And then obviously you can see that it's very much focusing on individuals. It's really hard to see how we can enforce, for example, collective redress, have access to collective remedies when entire groups of people are targeted by certain policing practices. It becomes even more complicated if those are escalated to the European level. Looking back at a more general level and at the institutional kind of check and balances system, it is not going very well. I have 5 more main criticisms. First, there is a general culture of despise, I would call it this way, towards human rights oversight. For example, in the OLAF report that Laure mentioned in her introduction, it was revealed that high-ranking executive of Frontex had been comparing the fundamental rights officer to the Khmer Rouge, so a dictatorial regime, which is a little bit exaggerating in my opinion. So there is this culture of despising human rights mechanism. Second, when we increase supervision mechanism, we tend to increase the one that are internal, for which we cannot guarantee independence. For example, the 2022 reform of Europol creates a FRO. This is really good, fundamental rights officer, but this person is going to be appointed by the management board of the agency upon the proposal by the executive director, and this person will only report to the executing director. So it poses a little bit the question of legitimacy and independence. And then when there is independent or external oversight mechanism, they are largely insufficient or rendered almost meaningless. And there I will mention briefly the EDPS, but I think Fanny has more to say about this. But the reform basically kind of postpone a little bit the certain or minimize, undermine the EDPS review processes. So sometimes Europol can allow itself to start a data processing without waiting for the authorization of the EDPS, which was mostly the case before. So it's not going in the right direction. Then I will briefly mention the Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group, which is a parliamentary oversight body for Europol, designed for Europol. It's composed of a mix of national parliamentarians, so from the national parliaments, and also the members of European Parliament. From the very few interviews I had with some members of this parliament, plus my own experience in following the work of this group, I would say that it's a body that lacks autonomy in organizing its own working methods, its topics of discussion, its meeting agendas. It is lacking a work culture to work as a watchdog, a proper watchdog that should hold Europol accountable, and it really fails to engage and coordinate its member towards that goal. It has very also limited access to information, just like we have a hard time as civil society to get access to information, to seek data and more information on what the agency are doing as operations. These parliamentary control bodies also are restricted in what they can obtain and therefore do their job properly. And lastly, I will finish with this point. It's more roaring. We are fearing that these mechanisms are sometimes used as red herring to justify even more intrusive measures or extensions of powers. They are, those mechanisms are often reduced as a tick box exercise. Oh yes, we consulted the FRO, don't worry. Oh yes, the EDPS is involved, don't worry. They did an investigation report, but we don't have access to the results of that report, for example. Or we're not sure that there encompasses all the aspect of a certain problem. Maybe they're missing one angle. I'm finishing on this example during the last GPSG meeting, so the Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group meeting. Saskia grilled a little bit the executive director, and I think one of her last arguments to close a little bit the debate and to sweep away the data protection and privacy concerns was like, there is supervision by the EDPS on the data exchange. So the EDPS is involved, don't ask for the question. I will finish on that.
Perfect, thank you, because we have the representative of the EDPS here present who can talk to us more about supervision of Europol and Frontex. So very pleased to be joined as well by Fanny Coudert, who's head of sector for the supervision of the AFSG, so the supervision of the area of freedom, security and justice at the European Data Protection Supervisor Authority. So Fanny, since we're running into time, I'm handing straight over to you to talk to us about your experience, the extent that you can, of supervising the two agencies we're discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Laure. I will build on what Chloe has just said and about the need of check and balances, maybe being a bit more optimistic. And trying to share some ideas on how to improve what we have already and how to build on what we have to go to something more efficient, actually. Two agencies have been mentioned, principally Europol and Frontex. It has been said that their mandate has been expanded considerably over the last years. their role in ensuring EU security and border management have grown substantially. They do not anymore limit themselves to provide mere support to member states. And I would say that they are even expected by the legislator to take up a much more prominent role. What it means is that the impact of the action on individual becomes much higher, obviously. And the risk of abuse, even if based on mistakes, it's also bigger. And this is magnified because of the scope of their action, which is EU-wide, as this has been mentioned, by the fact that they function in a way which is quite opaque because of a legitimate reason of public interest. And this will keep increasing because of the use of new technologies such as AI, which are much more powerful, more intrusive, and whose function is much more opaque as well. So it will become much more difficult to disentangle or identify errors or of wrongdoing. I think that that's the situation. What we can observe as well, that I would like to stress, and that there are fewer red lines actually drawn by the legislator in the different regulation. Maybe because the reality or the DHA ecosystem, I'm thinking about technical, organizational, political aspects, becomes more and more complex to regulate. Everything is being put in place to generate more data collection, more data sharing between the agencies and the member states, between member states, in order to also enable more decision based on risk analysis and risk profiling. So we are entering into an uncharted territory, I would say, and the absence of red line or even substantial safeguards is usually compensated by a stronger reliance on oversight, meaning on the assumption that the checks and balances put in place by this regulation are functioning and we play a role of control. But this seems to go together with a reflection on how this oversight or the system of check and balances should be designed in order to be efficient and to deliver its promises. At national level, the system of check and balances, even if it can still be improved, has been developing for years, maybe hundreds of years. So I think our challenge here is to build an efficient system of check and balances at EU level, meaning that we should take into account that agencies operate not in a vacuum by itself, in an isolated world, but EU structure embedded together with national structure as well. And this is an important element to take into account when we think how to design this system of check and balances. Because EU agencies and national authorities tend to hide behind each other when asked to give an account. And in order to achieve this goal, I don't think that only one institution by itself can act as a counterweight. The ecosystem is to supervise has become too complex. The impact on individual is so invisible that we need to build a system where different entities entrusted with oversight role act together to ensure accountability of these agencies and their national counterparts. And this means that each one should play its role and try to reinforce the other, working with a common goal, which is to ensure respect for individual rights and to build a fair society. I think that's why we're having this event today. So we have already a few instances in place. For Frontex, so we have internal control with the data protection officer, the fundamental rights officers, a consultative committee, which is external, but still at the level of Frontex, and the EDPS. For Europol, so far it was mainly the data protection officer and the EDPS with some parliamentary control, so the Europol Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group, which now will be given more power in terms of information it will be given, and which will be supported by a consultative committee, which will give expert advice on fundamental rights. So this is an improvement. And as Claire mentioned, the figure of a fundamental rights officer has been created. So this is a new role. It's new. Let's see how it works. So to give you a picture of how this works, this could work, this system, and how this could be maybe improved to give some ideas. So we have a first line with internal controls, data protection officer, fundamental rights officers, or in the case of Frontex, also fundamental rights monitors, who are doing incredible work. So they are supposed to act independently, and they have this advisory function. As a DPS, we work closely with data protection officer in order to provide guidance where requested, for instance, by issuing opinion on how the law should be interpreted and implemented on certain point. Then you have a second level, which is administrative supervision, so by the EDPS and national data protection authorities, which cooperation is organized structurally under the EDPB. So the particularity is that EDPS and national DPAs have enforcement power, but the scope of the competence is limited to interference into fundamental rights stemming from the processing of personal data. Meaning that, so on the one hand, so our cooperation is structurally organized, meaning that we are working together, trying to avoid any gap in the oversight, which is something we are developing slowly but surely under the umbrella of joint supervisory action. This is something to be built as well. Huh? It doesn't come out of the blue. But it means also that we have some limitation. We cannot deal with some problematic practice with a huge impact on fundamental rights if there is no processing of personal data. So I'm thinking, for instance, of all the scandals with the pushback from Frontex and or even the support that Frontex or Europol are providing to third countries such as Libya in order to help them create anti-terrorist cell and this kind of thing here. We cannot do anything. And this control is operated at another level, I would say, by fundamental rights officer, civil society, the parliament, maybe the ombudsman or OLAF. Then we have the level of political supervision. We have mentioned the Europol Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group. Also ad hoc initiatives such as the Libe Working Group on Frontex Scrutiny, which is also very useful. I understand the role of this control to publicly call into question the practice of these agencies. And maybe the limitation here is the access to information, as we see, and that's here where we could see some synergies already between supervision and political supervision, because as DPS we get also because we have dedicated person to the supervision, we get access to much more information, much more technical. We go much deeper because it's our day-to-day activity. And here we could really reinforce this synergy. And it's not the current format of the GPSG, but we could imagine the GPSG asking the EDPS to provide some information also on specific topics in order maybe to verify what Europol is saying or to get a more complete picture, or because so far the format is that the EDPS reports during a very limited time slot allocated to him, which is normally 10 minutes to report on what we have done during the last 6 months. So obviously the information provided is what it is. It's limited. So this just an idea that I'm sharing just for food for thoughts. And I think that could be extremely useful in the oversight of processing of large data sets by Europol, which is one of the new tasks of the GPSG, or exchange with third parties. Then I'd like to mention as well the role of civil society in this also check and balances system with consultative committees, journalists. And for me, I see the role of civil society is making public problematic practices when they manage to be known, or to amplify maybe the action of all the oversight bodies. Because I mean, the role is to call into account these agencies before the public, to whom ultimately they should be accountable to. And for me, civil society has also a key role as well on creating alternative narratives. And I think from what I heard from the first two presentations, that's exactly it. In raising the alarm, maybe on topic which all the oversight entity overlooked or didn't see because of their institutional position or because they cannot see everything. So to bring our attention to a certain problem, to build on the context of non-discrimination. I mean, the supervision of the use of algorithm by this agency. I mean, when we talk about, when we will have to check non-discrimination, which will be a key challenge, I would say, we don't have access to this information at national level of structural racism being reflected into police database. I remember the PNR judgment, this was mentioned, but nobody actually provided evidence of it. So that could be a role. About individual right mechanism, I think we should not diminish the importance of individual action, despite, I understand this is a very long road, because of the opacity of the whole system, but it is definitely opening the way to a stronger oversight. And I think that's because, I would say, unfortunately, this show that the concerns of the risk of mistake are real. And this illustrates, because I mean, we build on this feeling of risk, but when this happens, provide evidence that there was something that this has to be taken seriously. And then to complete the picture, I would say we have judicial supervision by the court. So our decisions are challengeable to the court. There's also a possibility to go to the court to ask for damages, because that's something we cannot. We don't have the power to provide damages. Or other, and I think that's a way to bring the judiciary into the picture, which is, it's not been brought too far, which is another form of control, and I think which is absolutely necessary in a healthy democratic system. So to conclude, I would say that we have several instances in place, several oversight bodies, but their work is a bit atomized. And in order to give more weight to the action, we should learn to work together to find complementarities and synergies.
Thank you so much, Shani. That's really incredibly helpful as well to have that broad picture of what oversight could look like. And I think it's really ties into the rule of law perspective, that the rule of law depends on many elements coming together. Many different forms of oversight through individual redress, through civil society, through judicial cases, through political means, through supervisory authorities. But ultimately, I think there's the key question that you raised around artificial intelligence, that we don't know, as long as we're not tackling the structural issues that we have in policing at national level that were pointed out in the first two presentations in terms of who is targeted, which data the police is collecting on what basis, how are we ever going to manage to create a sustainable and non-discriminatory form of policing at EU level? I don't know. I think we can discuss it here. So, so thank you very much. And I think also picking up on the alternative narratives, I think is really key. And I see that as a key role of civil society, is to resist the narratives that policing agencies, in particular Europol, as we heard in the past few meetings over the past few weeks, is pushing forward, how the Frontex narratives as well, that framing as a security issue, migration in itself is something as civil society we need to resist, to push back together, come together as coalition, working across movements to resist that. And try to change the narrative by looking at public safety in a different way. As you pointed out in the first presentation, it was about, how can we reflect on public safety beyond policing. So thank you, and I'll hand over to Saskia for the questions, to open to the questions or thoughts, reflections. All welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Laure. Thanks to all of you. The floor is yours. So go ahead with your questions, remarks. Anybody? I'm sure it opened a lot of reflections. Maybe it's also good if you have experiences or elements to share today and give food for thought, because it's also an ongoing process to improve checks, balances, oversight. Go ahead and present yourself very briefly. Brief questions, brief answers. Thanks for this question. Good question. Excellent question, actually. In the current framework of our migration, of our EU migration policy, we need presence in the member states to control the respect of fundamental rights. That's for sure. Fanny said, important role of the fundamental rights monitors on the ground. My experience, very short experience in Greece, shows that they have a limited control, effective control on the ground. Because they cannot be deployed everywhere on the border. They cannot control it all. They're not always there when it happens, when a pushback happens. And that's the same for the Frontex agents deployed on the ground. So I think there's a huge margin for improvement, but that they are essential. But this is not the model that we want, because in the first place, the role of Frontex has to be to protect fundamental rights of migrants. And the current role of Frontex is to protect the borders. And this is a complete different approach. I've heard here from all of the speakers that we need a human rights-based approach. I would say even a human approach. And this is lacking or even completely missing in Europe. And on the one hand, we cannot 100% blame the border countries, because it's an EU responsibility. And as long as there will not be a EU common approach based on solidarity and human rights, I think we'll turn around with the current practices. As long as we Europeans, with the support of the member states, will externalize our migration policy to external countries which are not respecting fundamental rights in general, and specifically fundamental rights of migrants, we will not change the consequences of this current approach, which is more of a Europe fortress leading to many deaths. We talk a lot about the Mediterranean, but we also have the same issues in other countries, Croatia, it has been mentioned, other countries which are not bordering the Mediterranean. So this is probably not answering black or white your question, but we are in a system where those people need to be on the ground, deployed with more power and more initiative power, I guess. We'll see at Europol level. I said short questions and I'm expanding my answer. That the fundamental rights officer inside the agencies are important. They probably lack resources, and they are, in my view, in a very difficult position to scrutinize the work of their colleagues, to address potential issues to their colleagues, and to be heard. And I think our agencies, Frontex, for sure, Europol is following, need a cultural change. And to try to be positive as you were, I think that bringing a fundamental rights officer inside Europol already brings the awareness, recognition somehow, that there are fundamental rights issues related to the mandate and the missions of Europol. And this is, let's remain positive. One step in the door again to go, to move towards better scrutiny.
Thank you so much for this meeting. Very informative and also very good to have this debate on this topic. My name is Romain Lano. I advise Frank van der Linde, but I'm also working with Statewatch. And I had some remarks, especially on the role of supervisory authority, which I think are expanding a lot. Especially concerning Europol, and especially the role of the EDPS is moving and shaping a lot. And I think the role of civil society in that regard is to point where maybe the role of the supervisory authority could be clarified, also by the European Court of Justice. And I also had a thought about the transparency, because you mentioned, for example, Fanny, that those new technologies will be way less transparent. But also, I notice doing a lot of access requests that when we do those access requests, what we get back a lot, especially from the Commission, are redacted documents where we cannot extract any information apart from the title. And I think there should be a lot of more fingers pointed at authorities which send out documents which are obviously ridiculous in terms of transparency and accountability. So I just wanted to really be annoyed about that. I also had a question a bit more specific to Fanny about the role of the EDPS on third country, on its role in as a supervisory authority or as advising on exchange of information deals between the European Union and third countries. If you could maybe talk a bit more about that, if you can.
We have an advisory role. We provide opinions. Well, I'm from a supervisory unit, so it's not really my realm. But then when it comes to the use, at least, of derogation in the Europol regulation, you see that they have to inform, Europol has to inform us when they transfer data to a country where there is no agreement in place, something like that. And we have also the power to go and inspect if we have any suspicion of unlawful. I don't know if this answers the question or which kind of information you were looking for.
Well, it's more about if there is like, text formal arguments on which the EDPS has been giving advice or.
On the agreement, on the mandate, I think everything is published. What the opinion we gave to the legislator is published on our website. So if you think about Europol, I think about this mandate to negotiate with MENA countries. I remember we did issue an opinion on that. So that's the kind of thing you can, this is fully transparent, you can find on our website.
Thanks. I didn't get if you have other questions or if this was the main question. It was more sharing experience with us, and I fully agree with you.
I could have other questions.
Yes. So I think there is a lot of room for improvement in terms of access to documents for individuals, and especially also the right, at least, to be informed. The right to information of individuals being listed, or the data being shared between agencies, and again, sharing experience, and coming back from Greece, but also working more broadly on the PEGA issue, Pegasus, and the system of surveillance and spying on individuals, shows there are a lot of loopholes in the law, and also a big problem of non-implementation of the law, and law related to data privacy. And what if the law is not respected? Who sanctions? Who scrutinizes when a member state doesn't respect the right to privacy? This is also a big issue for the European Commission. One very last intervention, up to you.
I hope I will be fast, but I cannot promise that. My name is Caterina Ordelli. I'm from Access Now. Together with EDRI and PICUM, we call it Civil Society Coalition on the AI Act and how it impacts the rights of people on the move and people belonging to racialized communities. And as Michelle was saying, we have advanced some recommendations on how the AI Act could prevent and address harms provoked by AI systems. And my question is a question that has a lot of ifs, because there is a lot of like recommendations that we are doing like to the AI Act on how to improve the legislation in a way that protects fundamental rights. And one is to improve like transparency and individual rights, for example, like having a database where public authorities should register the use of high-risk systems, providing individuals with like individual rights and redress mechanisms if they want to seek justice, and also conducting fundamental rights impact assessment before the deployment. So considering that these like three elements might end up in the final legislation, would you think that these kind of extra accountability and transparency measures could apply to Europol and help with improving transparency as well? Because again, in an ideal world, Europol would be held accountable under the AI Act and therefore asked to register the use of AI systems that process like large amount of data and automated risk assessment. And considering that my question is highly hypothetical, is another legislation measure that could improve accountability? Is that like a way that we should look for, or is it is an instrument that might not help in this regard? So I'm looking at you, Fanny, but like sharing the question among the panelists. Thank you.
I will just say we already, even without the AI Act, I think we have already a lot of tools to check, to hold accountable Europol when using. I think even the amended Europol regulation introduced new mechanism, and that's something already on which we can build with the concept of data protection impact assessment, prior consultations, because I mean, if we look at data protection as a way, not only as a right by itself, but also the way to, in interference in data protection, instrumental right now could have an impact on other rights. So, yeah, I would just like to say that I think we can start by using the tool we have, and yeah, we know that Europol is excluded from the scope of the AI Act. I will not comment on that, but we have other tools.
We have indeed like a good basis with already what's in the Europol regulation plus the data protection framework. But it's true that it could always be expanded. As I mentioned, there is one thing of having individual data protection rights on paper and then having them in practice. We see already like a big discussion going back at European level on the GDPR and the implementation of this data protection framework, and how sometimes we don't have resources, we don't have budget to basically making the rights reality. That could be definitely something of an object of an evaluation process, and making sure that in the next reform of Europol mandate, which is likely coming soon, I don't know, we have much more concrete measures to enforce individual rights. In terms of transparency, there are mechanisms that involves the NDPS, but that doesn't mean that it will necessarily become public information, if I'm not mistaken. So this is also like a margin of improvement that we can work on or work with. Do you want to add?
I would just say when it comes to predictive policing, Fair Trials has been asking and advocating for a complete ban on predictive policing in terms of future criminality. And it's quite shocking to see a democratic process in play where Europol has effectively in their mandate is not facing that sort of restriction at all, despite it being seriously considered and hopefully to be adopted in the EU AI Act. So again, a question of, we talked a lot about double standards, and here as well, how the EU policing agency, especially when we see their role, for instance, that Saskia pointed out on Clearview, on promoting certain technologies to national member state authorities without any consideration of the legal frameworks in place, and resulting in the Belgian authorities, for instance, using Clearview in complete illegality, and the police officers not even being aware or claiming they were not aware that it was illegal. And having tested this technology at Europol premises. And here again, when it comes to predictive types of systems, are we looking at the same sort of model? Even if we get an AI Act that's robust enough and includes a complete prohibition, we still have this question mark around Europol and what they're allowed to do, and then what they're going to be promoting to member states through their cooperation with private companies, for instance, where we have no transparency about what that involves. I mean, you pointed out as well that as part of your role in the Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group, that when you ask for information, you receive redacted agendas, redacted names of who's been participating, who invited these private companies. You know, so how, I mean, it just feels that there's a big gap there. And to your question, I would, if it's not, to the extent that the AI Act doesn't cover Europol, I think we will need some legal revision to the Europol mandate to ensure that there is such a prohibition on predictive policing.
Thank you very much. We can keep talking around a small drink I propose to share with you. I want to really thank you very much for your interventions, for all these fruitful thoughts. I think we're not over it. There's room for improvement, as Chloe just said, for sure. And that's why we are here today together. Thanks for raising, and I think this is a common line, the need for other ways for policing and a human rights-based approach, be it at Europol level, be it in migration issues, especially also for bringing up vulnerable categories, be it migrants, undocumented people, and also people issued from racial minorities, for instance, that are particularly impacted, vulnerable, and have more difficult access to remedy. Thank you also for pointing out the main problems, because there are many others, but the main problems related to the Europol reform. And thank you for bringing some hope and perspectives, because it's also necessary to see where we are going to and how it can be improved. At my level, modestly, we're working on a better joint parliamentary scrutiny group to try to push our colleagues to have a proper scrutiny. I'm talking about the EU level. We need also the national members present in the Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group to be more active in the sense of scrutinizing the work of Europol. So if you have any contacts with MPs in this structure, or good MPs that you would like to get involved in the Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group, I think this is a common challenge. You called, Fanny, on working together. I think this is a way we can work together, is to have MPs and MEPs in this scrutiny group that really want to bring the issues on the table and to scrutinize the Europol, because I fear that many issues that have popped up will also pop up in the future related to data privacy, but also more broadly fundamental rights issues. And so far, most of the MPs I see in this joint parliamentary scrutiny group are more Europol supporters instead of Europol scrutinizers. And so I think there's definitely room for improvement. Also to have an agenda with topics which are not conference-like, or which are not moments to have keynote speeches by the Commission, by everyone people would like to listen to, but to have a real question time and, as you said, proper answers, access to documents, and not just the answers they want to provide us. And that's also the limits of our work, because we are not investigators, we're lawmakers. And why this consistency forum, for me, even if it's one little element, might be really in the future helpful, because if we have experts around the table that we are able to question, and those experts to alert us on specific issues, that might also help to have a better scrutiny of, I'm talking here on Europol, and of course many challenges face also Frontex. I see you, and I would like to thank you for being here because MEPs were represented by their assistants, Frank, who represents Patrick Breyer from my group, from the Pirates, working a lot on all these issues. Gwendoline Delvaux-Corfield was also represented. And I see that Cyrus Engerer, sorry for the pronunciation, is also represented. So please thank him for joining and to you for staying and listening also. And of course, Birgit Sippel. Some hope, and I'll end here. In the beginning of the work on the Europol reform, there were 2-3 MEPs concerned about the issues that we've been talking about. At the end of the Europol reform, unfortunately, at the end of the trilogues, it came too late, but more MEPs intervened in the plenary session at the end of the trilogue to raise concerns. So the more we talk about it, the more you lobby MEPs, the better, because I think it's also, unfortunately, just a lack of knowledge of what's going on. What are the issues related to artificial intelligence? So this needs more public awareness and political awareness. So let's go to work. Thank you for joining and have a nice evening.